Hello, everyone. And first of all, I want to thank the organizing team for this great conference. I'm very happy to be here. My name is François Kammerer, and I'm a philosopher. I'm actually not in Paris. I'm in Strasbourg, but I'm employed by the Sirens, and their headquarters are in Paris. Otherwise, it's correct. And I'm going to present to you a draft of a chapter that has circulated among you. And the chapter is titled The Science of Sirens, Illusionism and the Science of Consciousness. So I'm very grateful to those of you who have read the chapter in advance. I don't know if this is many of you. So when I suggested presenting this chapter to Artem, I think I had a wrong idea about this conference. I thought it would be like a small workshop where we all exchange papers, and it turned out to be this giant conference, so I assume most of you have not read the chapter. So what I'm going to do is just give a 20-minute presentation of this draft chapter. And after that, we'll have a debate with Artem and with whoever of you wants to join. And I hope that these 20 minutes are enough to give you an idea of what is in there and maybe the main ideas. Yeah, maybe not all the arguments, but the main ideas. So first of all, some elements of context. The chapter takes place within a book manuscript that I'm currently trying to write. And the book will defend my version of illusionism about phenomenal consciousness and explore its implications in various domains. By illusionism about phenomenal consciousness, I mean strong illusionism in Keith Frankish sense. That is to say, the view that phenomenal consciousness does not exist, but seems to exist. So it's in a sense an illusion. So in my mind, and I will assume this, the main opponent of the illusionist is what I call the phenomenal realist, the one who accepts the existence of phenomenal consciousness. So this chapter is focusing on illusionism implications for the science of consciousness. So I think and hope it's more or less readable independently of the rest of the manuscript. But of course, in this chapter, there are no arguments for illusionism. So the best way to read it is just to read it as a set of conditional claims of the form, if we embrace illusionism, we should do X and Y with the science of consciousness. And I think that all of you who have non-negligible credence in illusionism find that probably important. And even those of you who are certain that it's wrong could still find it intellectually interesting, I hope. Last thing, I plan to finish the overall book manuscript in the next, 6 months if everything goes well. So if you have comments that you want to send, please do it. And you don't need to do it now, but even if you have comments in 2 weeks, I would be super happy to receive them. Okay, so what I do in the draft, in the first section, is start with the example of sirens, part fish, part human sirens, or mermaids in English. And I use this example throughout the chapter to illuminate the case of consciousness science. So human-like sirens or mermaids were once thought to exist by Europeans. For instance, Christopher Columbus reported sighting 3 sirenas in his first voyage to America, stressing that they are not so beautiful as they are painted, though to some extent they have the form of a human face. So we now think that human-like sirens do not exist. European scholars do not take their existence seriously since the late 18th century, more or less. We still think that some real animals exist, which probably caused some real, illusory sightings of sirens. For instance, manatees, such as Trichechus manatus, which you see here, which is now placed in an order called Sirenia, and which Columbus probably saw in America. Manatees exist. But manatees do not resemble humans in any deep sense, not than any other marine mammals. Anatomically, cognitively, evolutionarily, actually when it comes to cognitive and evolutionary properties, they might even be more further away from humans than other marine mammals, as far as I have understood. So it's only really superficially, when seen from a distance rising from the water, that they might have a visual appearance of a human being. Here I give, in the chapter I give a bit more details about that, but what matters for my view here is that if illusionism is true, I think that the science of consciousness as it currently is should be treated a little bit like a science of sirens, in a sense that I think can be illuminating and that I will try to explain now. So in section 2, I turn to the current state of the science of consciousness. So, as I understand it, the science of consciousness, at least for a big part of it, maybe not all of it, but a part of it, tries to study phenomenal consciousness, and it notably tries to solve 3 questions. One is the basis question. So what is the cognitive and neural basis of phenomenal consciousness? We could also call that the NCC question for neural correlates of consciousness questions. One other is the extension question. Which of our mental states are phenomenally conscious? And the third question is the distribution question. Which creatures are phenomenally conscious? And on all of these questions, there is deep and persisting disagreement with very little consensus in sight. For instance, on the basis question, we have multiple scientific theories of the basis of consciousness that are in conflict. And the conflict is sometimes very brutal, right? Some of you might remember the open letter of last fall signed by, I think, 100 researchers from science and philosophy calling IIT, which is a fairly influential theory of the basis of consciousness, or maybe of consciousness tout court, and the letter called IIT pseudoscience. So I think it illustrates, I don't want to reopen wounds, but I think it illustrates how deep the disagreement and the conflict is in the field regarding the basis question. But on the extension question, we also have persisting debate that seem extremely hard to solve, such as the overflow debate. And on the distribution question, pretty much all answers have been defended in the last decades regarding which creatures are phenomenally conscious. Like from the view that, well, illusionists say that no one is phenomenally conscious. Some people say that only human adults. Some people say that maybe all animals are phenomenally conscious. Some people draw the line somewhere, maybe somewhere around ants. Some people say that all living beings, or maybe everything at the fundamental level, is phenomenally conscious. So that shows again the deep and persisting disagreement. And I think that if you contemplate the state of current consciousness science, and you see this deep and persisting, sometimes brutal disagreement, you might be easily tempted by something like skepticism or pessimism and suspect that maybe phenomenal consciousness just lies beyond the reach of science. So in section 3, what I do is I examine 2 tempting but ultimately misguided views of what illusionism implies for the science of consciousness. So basically, if someone tells you, well, I'm an illusionist, I think that phenomenal consciousness does not exist, it just seems to exist. One rather natural way of looking at the implication of this view for the science of consciousness would be to say, okay, so that means that consciousness science is just useless, it's just pointless. I think it's very, very intuitive, right? If it does not exist, then the science of consciousness, at least to the extent that it studies phenomenal consciousness, should be entirely discarded. Maybe consciousness scientists can still study functionally defined forms of consciousness, such as access consciousness or self-consciousness. But if they aim at studying on top of that phenomenal consciousness, then they are a bit like cryptozoologists studying human-like sirens nowadays, right? We should not take them seriously. They are doing something that is entirely pointless. Consciousness science, at least to the extent that it aims at studying phenomenal consciousness, is just good for the garbage bin. I think that there is, of course, a grain of truth in this radical view, but I also think that it is too simplistic and ultimately misguided. Why? So it's true that illusionism denies phenomenal consciousness, but it also admits the existence of tightly related phenomena. First, the illusion of phenomenal consciousness itself, and second, what Keith Frankish calls, with this sort of long expression but is convenient, quasi-phenomenal consciousness. So what is quasi-phenomenal consciousness? Keith Frankish defines it as like the set of real mental states, maybe for instance brain states, that we tend to mischaracterize as phenomenal, for instance in introspection, notably because these mental states tend to trigger these introspective illusions of phenomenal experiences. So basically the idea is that our brain enter real states. Some of these states trigger illusions of phenomenal experiences. So these states are sort of tracked by our illusions of phenomenal experiences. They themselves are not phenomenal. They don't have this what it's likeness that characterizes phenomenal consciousness, but they are real as brain states. And we can call these brain states quasi-phenomenal states and call the set of them quasi-phenomenal consciousness. But then, we can answer the radical view of the implications of illusionism, because we can say, well, maybe the parts of consciousness science that currently tries to study phenomenal consciousness can sort of be roughly conserved if we just reinterpret them as actually studying quasi-phenomenal consciousness. So in this perspective, we can say, well, what consciousness scientists are doing, even if maybe they don't know it, is they are studying quasi-phenomenal consciousness, the form of consciousness that seems phenomenal but is not really phenomenal. So once you say that, you might be tempted by some sort of polar opposite of the radical view, which I call the quietist view. The quietist view says that basically illusionism leaves consciousness science roughly untouched outside of a few verbal adjustments and some change in the metaphysical gloss. So for instance, one could say, well, once you accept illusionism, you can go on doing consciousness science exactly the way you were doing it, with the same questions, the same problems, the same methods, maybe also the same disagreements. It's just that now it must actually be reinterpreted as bearing on quasi-phenomenal consciousness and not phenomenal consciousness. It just studies the mental states we thought wrongly were phenomenal but aren't. So on this quietist view, illusionism really just is some sort of metaphysical conception without any scientific import. Science of consciousness can continue, business as usual. It's a little bit like, philosophers like to debate about whether or not atoms assembled table-wise form really a table or not. It does not really matter to carpenters or to whichever engineers work at IKEA. They still do the same tables and they don't care about mereology. So basically the rest of my chapter from there is mostly devoted to argue against this quietist view. So what I want to show is that illusionism is a philosophical position, but it has serious, non-simplistic, but also not so radical, whether or not they are radical, that's another debate, but not simplistic implications for the way consciousness science should be conducted. So in the section 4 to 7 of the chapter, I try to lay down these implications. I will not go over these sections in detail because I just don't have the time for that. I would just try to sum them up rather briefly, hoping that you still get the gist of what is in these sections. So section 4 focuses on what I take to be the most straightforward implications of illusionism for consciousness science. There are mostly two of them. One is that illusionism denies the existence of the entity about which the hard problem arises. So that means that we don't need to solve the hard problem anymore. And that means that we should evaluate theories differently because their apparent ability to solve the hard problem is not really an advantage anymore. And the second most straightforward implication is that if we take illusionism seriously, we have also good reasons to believe that the way we introspect our real conscious states, or our quasi-phenomenal states, is deeply mischaracterizing. So we should probably not trust introspection to sort of determine the basic nature of consciousness. So it goes against some suggestion that we can obtain on the basis of introspection, some sort of axioms to then theorize about consciousness, like some proponents of IIT have it. Well, I'm slower than I thought, so. After that, so in section 5, basically what I stress is that if you're an illusionist, basically you deny the existence of phenomenal consciousness and you admit the existence of two other phenomena of interest, which are first the illusion of phenomenal consciousness and second quasi-phenomenal consciousness. And what I try to show is that it forces scientists to disambiguate their claims when they make claims about the basis, extension and distribution of consciousness, and that's actually an advantage because it opens perspective for conciliation between views that apparently seem opposed. For instance, one could say, if you look at oppositions regarding the distribution of consciousness between some people saying, well, everything is conscious down to unicellular organisms, or maybe not, let's say down to insects, and some people will say, no, only humans and maybe chimps are conscious. Maybe this looks like a very stark disagreement that cannot be solved, but maybe you can just conciliate this position by understanding that they are actually about different things. One is about quasi-phenomenal consciousness, and one is just about some introspective illusion or maybe some precursor of the illusion that might be reserved to complex creatures capable of metacognition. Section 6 is devoted to discuss the issue of consciousness and indeterminacy. So basically what I do in this section is that I go back to some arguments that have been advanced, usually from a realist but materialist perspective, for example, by people like David Papineau or Peter Carruthers. They have advanced arguments for the view that the distribution of phenomenal consciousness is likely to be indeterminate. That is to say, it's likely to be not just a few cases, but many cases of animals for which they are neither determinately phenomenally conscious nor determinately non-phenomenally conscious. And basically what I do is that I take these arguments again and I try to show that illusionism makes them even stronger, basically because the main objection to this thesis is inoperant if we embrace illusionism. So if we're illusionists, it's really quite likely that quasi-phenomenal consciousness is widely indeterminate. And section 7, which in some sense is quite simple, I think, to grasp, but it's quite important, deals with the informativity of consciousness claims. And here what I'm trying to do is that if we assume that illusionism is true, and we must also admit that there is a stark difference between claims about quasi-phenomenal consciousness versus claims about phenomenal consciousness in a realist perspective. Why? Because if you're a realist, usually you will think that learning something about phenomenal consciousness, for instance, learning that a certain creature is phenomenally conscious, you will think that this is a very informative claim. You will think that it imparts you with some substantive and important knowledge about this creature. Let's say we discover that ChatGPT is conscious. That seems pretty important. Like we learn, and then you can use whichever metaphor you prefer. We learn that someone is home, or that the lights are on, or that there is something it's like to be ChatGPT. It seems like you're really learning something. But if you are an illusionist and you think that all you can learn is rather that ChatGPT is quasi-phenomenally conscious, and when you learn that, you don't learn that much. What you learn is, at least as long as you've not done a lot of science, what you learn, like the content of this claim per se, if you don't have a theory of what quasi-phenomenal consciousness is really just that ChatGPT has states of the same sort as those that trigger certain sort of introspection in us. That's a highly indirect relational characterization of these states. It's not a very substantive form of knowledge that you acquire about this being. It does not really tell you how its mind works or what sort of capacities it has. Then section 8 sort of comes back to the idea of sirens and the metaphor of sirens. And basically, what it's trying to do is that it draws the implications of what I argued in the previous sections using the comparison with sirens. So when it comes to sirens, basically, we admit that they do not exist. But we also admit that related phenomena exist which can be studied. So in the case of sirens, we have on the one hand the real, quote-unquote, sirens, so the human-like sirens, the mermaids, and they do not exist. They cannot be studied. There is no science of mermaids. But then we are also what we could call, of course no one calls them that way, but we could call them quasi-sirens. So quasi-sirens, what are they? They are creatures that have been causing more or less robustly illusory sightings of sirens. So among these creatures, typically you will find manatees, maybe some other creatures. When Carl Linnaeus tried to look for sirens, all he found was this little amphibian, which is now called Sirenia lacertina. So maybe you could count that also as a quasi-siren. So you find real creatures that are really studied by biologists. And third, of course, you have real illusory sightings of sirens. Like Christopher Columbus, we have all reasons to believe that he really had some sort of visual impression that led him to report seeing sirens. That's some things that we can study, that historians and anthropologists can study illusory sightings of sirens throughout centuries. However, when it comes to sirens, we really easily admit that knowing whether or not something is a quasi-siren is not very important. It's not entirely uninteresting, right? It's sort of, it satisfies some sort of curiosity to know that these manatees were actually the things that Christopher Columbus saw and mistook for sirens. But it does not tell us anything deep and important about manatees. It does not tell us about their life cycle, about how they behave, about how they reproduce, about how they think, etc. And we also admit quite easily, I think, that it's very likely, it's not very likely, but it's a very open possibility that there is no ultimate fact of the matter about what are quasi-sirens. Like, should we just draw the line at manatees? Should we also include dugongs, for instance, which live in the Indian Ocean and also sometimes seem to be associated with legends according to which they are human-like? Or should we include all sorts of marine creatures that have ever triggered this sort of impression? It's not clear that there is such a thing as a right answer here, and it should not preoccupy us too much. We really, I think, easily admit that there is no deep fact of the matter, or there might not be a deep fact of the matter here. And for all these reasons, I think it's quite clear also that marine biologists, for instance, should not prioritize research on quasi-sirens. Right? They should just try to look at the real creatures in the sea, understand them for themselves. And the idea is that, in fact, there were the creatures causing these illusory sightings should just be an afterthought, not a guideline of their research. So my view is that if we take illusionism seriously, we should do a little bit the same thing about phenomenal consciousness. Admit that it does not exist, admit that related phenomena exist and can be studied, like quasi-phenomenal consciousness and the illusion of phenomenal consciousness, but also admit that research on these phenomena, and notably on quasi-phenomenal consciousness, should probably not be prioritized for the very same reasons we should not prioritize research on quasi-sirens. Again, why? Because learning about that is not very informative in itself, and because it claims about this is likely to have, in many cases, just indeterminate truth value. And finally, our very last section in the chapter, where basically I sort of recognize one possible objection, like some sort of general objection, which is many readers might just read this and answer, well, you're trying to tell us what we should do with the science of consciousness if we're illusionists. But the result, like illusionist consciousness science, just is not consciousness science at all. Why? Because it just discards the real phenomenon of interest. It discards the data that we had at our disposal. You're just doing something else. You're doing some sort of botched science that does not deserve the title of science of consciousness. It's a bit like astronomy if we denied the existence of stars. It does not really seem like we're still doing astronomy at all. And what I want to do is not really deeply answer this objection, but more like sort of read it through a standard concept of like historians and philosophers of science, which is the concept of paradigm competition. Basically following Kuhn and Feuer-Abend, I note that competition between scientific paradigms often involve disagreement about some basic data that can only be accommodated within one of the two paradigms. So one classical example analyzed by Feuer-Abend, and which he also used to give some sort of first argument for materialist eliminativism about the mind, is the case of the opposition between the like geocentrist Aristotelian and the heliocentrist like Copernico-Galilean. And basically the Aristotelian said, well, it's obvious that the Earth does not move. The Earth is still, it's obvious, it's some sort of basic data which is contradicted by your view, so we can rule out your view because it does not account for this sort of basic evidence. And I think that the same sort of can be used to understand the opposition between illusionism and realism. It can be read as a conflict between paradigm with disagreement about the basic data. And okay, I'm going to go a bit faster, and just to say that in my view, if we just go back to what Kuhn was saying about paradigms, what he said is that the paradigm that wins is never really one that wins because it convinces the proponents of the other paradigm in their own terms that their views are better. Like in this sort of very strong case of paradigms opposition, you cannot do that because in the other camp's terms, your theory is inferior. All you can do is sort of show that your own paradigm has better promises of success, that it promises to look at things differently and maybe more fruitfully. And like I hope to have contributed on a little scale to sort of show you why illusionism has promises of success, right? Because there is this deep disagreement in the field of consciousness science, and that illusionism promises to sort of dissolve some of these debates as by various distinctions. And so, yeah, in my mind, that should sort of contribute to making the view appealing. So thank you very much for your attention. Grazie a tutti. And now it's time for Artem.
Thanks very much. Okay, so now Artem will explain why François is completely wrong.
Thank you.
In 20 minutes.
Thank you, François, for sharing this paper. I believe that such kind of activity should be standard activity in the Center for Consciousness Studies. Okay, I must say that I'm also very sympathetic to illusionism, and for me, this chapter is important as for an illusionist, first of all, and I think that it is very important for illusionists to choose a correct analogy of the illusion of consciousness. We all know that when an illusionist presents his or her view, the first question is, what kind of illusion do you have in mind? Can you give any example of an illusion? And if you give a wrong example, then you make wrong impression. And I do not have in mind only lay people. The same question arises every time you speak with philosophers, Qualia realists, and so on. And I think that the analogy of Sirens is very misleading. First of all, there are very big differences between supposed Qualia, supposed phenomenal consciousness, and Sirens. There is very few evidence for existence of Sirens, and there is abundant evidence for existence of a phenomenal consciousness. That's something that an illusionist cannot deny. That's a point that illusionists must start with, that we all have this kind of illusion. It's not something that some extraordinary people have. Some sailors, some travelers to distant parts of the world have seen. It's something that everybody is acquainted with. Next, Sirens are objects, and phenomenal consciousness most probably it's a property. I mean that usually it's is regarded as a property, and then how can you apply this analogy to the questions that you raise about the basis, extension, and distribution? How those topics can be applied to the Sirens? Let me suggest another illusion that I think can be a bit better than the illusion, than the analogy of Sirens. There are various ways in which something may not exist in our world. In some sense, we can say that the clouds do not exist. What do I mean? There is an illusion that a cloud, imagine a wide, large, beautiful cloud. It is an object that is floating up in the sky, but there are problems with interpreting clouds as special objects. One of the problems concerns the borders of this object. And there is a way to avoid the paradoxes that raise from the claim that clouds are objects. There is a way that is an illusionist way to say that there are no such objects as clouds, but still there are molecules of water, there is vapor, and so on. And to my mind, although this analogy is imperfect, it is better in some sense, because you still can have a science of clouds. I mean that meteorology is a sphere of research that talks about clouds, makes some predictions about clouds, and I believe that this is not a form of quietism, as you call it. I mean that a meteorology that would accept a metaphysical claim that there are clouds, I mean, like regular objects, would be quite different meteorology. But let me proceed to some other issue. What about the theories? There is something misleading in reification the object of science. I will explain what I mean. When you say that there is science of consciousness, there is a temptation to take this phrase in a very literal sense, that there is consciousness and science about it. Let me introduce a very simplified Baconian picture of science. In some sense, the only object of science is nature. And in the case of the science of consciousness, the object of the science is a human being, the human being. And this is an object that is analogous to sirens, but then the analogy does not work at all. And this science begins with gathering evidence. We collect some evidence, make experiments, then we make some induction in Baconian sense, and then we create a theory. Where does consciousness go in all this structure? There is a step of evidence, and there is a step of collecting evidence, and there is a step of collecting creating a theory. And I think that we can talk about consciousness on both steps, but there will be different issues. We will have different problems here. What do I mean by this? Let's take the theories that you are describing. So you say that there are several theories of consciousness: global workspace theory, recurrent theory, higher order theory, and you mention Tanoni's what's Tanoni's theory? IIT, integrated information theory, sorry. Okay, let's analyze them in the terms that I suggest. So they take into account some evidence about consciousness. To my mind, the evidence that those theories take into account is roughly the same, and there is a problem with your interpretation. I disagree with your interpretation. On page 6 of the PDF, you say that there are 3 points that plausibly explain why consciousness science is such a highly conflictual field, and the points are: first, subjective reports converge in simple cases; second, even setting aside the problems, subjective reports remain unavailable for non-humans, so only subjective methods seem antecedently adequate to study phenomenal consciousness. So 2 points, not 3 points. It seems there are 2 points. So it doesn't seem to me that that consciousness science is highly conflictual field because of this. I'm quite sure that if you give different consciousness scientists exactly the same evidence, they will give different interpretations for the theoretical reasons, and not for the reasons that introspection is vague, misleading, and so on. And the theories, a more important point now, the theories that you mention are not the theories of phenomenal consciousness at all, in a very important sense. They begin with evidence that is not theoretically loaded, and they try to explain this evidence. And then in explaining it, they can use or cannot, or they may use or may not use the concept of phenomenal consciousness. And if we look at those theories, we will see that they do not need phenomenal consciousness for explanation of the evidence that they are addressing. They add the concept of phenomenal consciousness as something that is not really necessary for a theory. It is just an addition that is made maybe in favor of philosophical intuitions of the readers or of the authors of those theories. When a theory gives such an explanation, it stops to be a scientific theory of consciousness. It becomes a philosophical theory. It adds some philosophical thesis that says there is some X, and this X is equivalent to phenomenal consciousness. This is not a scientific claim at all. Then, you suggest that there are several points of impact of illusionism on the science of consciousness. I think that your analysis of indeterminacy and this view on the dual consciousness, this analysis is very persuasive, and I like this part of the chapter, but at some instant you yourself mentioned that we can accept all this argumentation even if we are Qualia realists. So it seems that illusionism only makes those conclusions easier, but the illusionism is not necessary for those conclusions. And I'm not sure about your conclusion of non-informativity of theory of quasi-phenomenal properties. I think that there may be some informativity here, but maybe not for the science of consciousness. I would say, and this is a part of my personal philosophical position, I would say that if there is a phenomenal or quasi-phenomenal property that is instantiated in some physical system, then that physical system, or at least those parts that are the realizers of those quasi-phenomenal properties, that physical system constitutes one thing in a strict metaphysical sense. But that is a part of my view. If someone wants, I can give arguments for that. And I think a very good thing in your view is this dual view of consciousness. For an illusionist, it is very important to distinguish the illusion. First are quasi-phenomenal properties, and then goes the illusion of phenomenality. Yes, and it's important for an illusionist to distinguish them. So we have the evidence for existence of phenomenal consciousness, and then we have some introspection, some capacity for introspection that gives us access to this, to the evidence about the existence of phenomenal consciousness. And my last point, I think that there is maybe methodological, maybe aesthetic problem with your chapter. You suggest a radical solution that does not leave any way of retreat. I mean that. I mean something like this. What if? Let's take the Daniel Stolger's view, the epistemic approach to consciousness. What if the future science discovers some new evidence? Why you exclude this possibility a priori? I think there are no good reasons to exclude it. Maybe there is some way to explain phenomenal consciousness, and there are some very strong reasons, I think, for so-called epistemic hope. If you look on this question from the point of view of the virtue epistemology, you can see that your approach is not absolutely virtuous in this sense. So hope, the epistemic hope, is one of epistemic virtues, and it would be good, I think, and it would be good for us if qualia existed, and if the evidence that we have for phenomenal consciousness, this evidence is veridical, and so on. And I think that we should leave some room for hope in your theory. So I stop now. Thank you.